Now, we're going to do something a little different to begin our program. And I'd like to invite Margaret Jenny, President of RTCA, to join me on stage for what we're calling a conversation. I will say that this concept, or this idea, is not new to Margaret and me. We actually, I think she'll remember, we actually did this for the first time, I think about 8 years ago at AOPA, when AOPA launched AOPA Live, and we began videotaping our conferences and our programs. Margaret and I sat down, you do remember, because we both thought that this thing called Task Force 5 and Next Gen needed a little bit more attention than it was getting. Boy, has it gotten attention. We succeeded mightily then. But in thinking about the program today, I thought it might be interesting to hear from the person who runs this day in and day out. And you know what I've found about many organizations, and particularly about RTCA, is that each and every one of you know a great deal about a small slice of RTCA. That's not a criticism. That's just the reality. You serve on a committee, you work on a task force, you're involved in the NAC, the DAC, and so you become intimately involved with the organization, the people at the organization that support the committee or that you're involved in. But you don't always get the sense and the depth and the breadth of this organization. And so Margaret's with us for just a few minutes this morning to kind of kick this off. So Margaret, welcome.
Thank you,
It's always
Craig.
nice to do this.
Thank you.
You know, I say people know a small slice, but there's lots of slices.
Right.
I did tell her this question was coming, so why don't you lead us off by talking a little bit about what RTCA looks like today and some of the activities you're engaged in.
Thank you very much, Craig. And I have to admit, anticipate this question, and I have a little help. We put together, I don't know if any of you are familiar with something called the Harper's Index that's published in their paper. I wanted to give you a sense of the whole breadth, as Craig puts it, that happens at RTCA. Most of you in this room are involved in some aspect of that. We at RTCA are here to try to help you make that happen. So here's just a few statistics at a glance for what's happened at RTCA over the last year. So we do have 27 federal advisory committees. Some people might not know that. So we have our 4 higher level, the Next Gen Advisory Committee, the Tactical Ops Committee, the Drone Advisory Committee, or the DAC, and the Program Management Committee, the PMC, that oversees then another 24 special committees, each of them in their own right a federal advisory committee, developing standards. Over the last year, you can see we've had 1,012 meetings.
So I'm going to jump in here for a minute. I'm going to jump in for a minute. So 27 federal advisory committees. Who creates these? How do they get created?
So they get created by the FAA. So one of the things that I think maybe is unique about RTCA, which is also known as a standards organization, is that we don't our assignments aren't done by ourselves. We are asked by the FAA, and the importance of that is that we know that when the work is done, the FAA is going to use it. So that either shows up in a TSO or advisory circular, or it influences their plans, their investment plans for Next Gen.
And even though the FAA asks you to form the advisory committee, and you have all these committee meetings, I'm not sure in all, but I know in most, if not all, FAA staff participate. So right from the start, they've asked for advice, but they're also willing to engage in the process of arriving at some consensus.
And that's a tricky question because it's an advisory committee. It is advice. We adhere to the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and so the FAA walks a balance there. They tell us what they want. They help us put the charters and the terms of reference together for the committees, and they provide designated federal official to help with agenda and the leadership. But they don't give themselves advice. So that's the key part. So they will provide subject matter experts across the gamut of the committees, and that's really to help the committees know what their constraints are so that when the recommendations do finally arrive at their doorstep, they aren't something that they can't implement.
So how do you marshal nearly 2,500 participants in this?
It's a good question, and I think it's, and maybe another one I might have anticipated. Let me just walk you through kind of the essence of who I think.
She's always so prepared.
Who I think we are. So the essence of RTCA, many of you know, is that we run these advisory committees. But how that happens, and the most important thing about the work we do is that it's transparent, meaning pretty much anyone who wants to get involved, especially on our standards committees, can come and get involved. All of the meetings of the advisory committees are open to the public. And our goal is to bring people who have very different ideas to finding some kind of common ground so that when we go back to the FAA, they're getting a single answer. And it's much easier for them then to implement as opposed to having lots of different people saying what they want. To get to common ground, you need to define a common language. Now, those of us in traditional manned aviation are pretty good at that. In fact, we have way too many acronyms. As we stood up the Drone Advisory Committee, we don't have a common language. We really don't have a common language. So we're spending a lot of the initial months working on that. We have a global reach. Again, Christian and Anna are here from EuroK. Half of our standards are joint with them. And that is to help us ultimately have an influence at ICAO. When we do standards together with Europe, they're much more likely to become global standards. So that's more leverage for all of you who work on those standards. Again, our taskings come from the FAA. Then when we get a task, we work with the FAA to define what stakeholder groups need to be on there, and we need to look for balance and broad reach when we set up an advisory committee. A lot of diversity on the committees, a lot of different agenda, that's okay. We understand everyone has an agenda. What we do is we work then with that common language to build trust among the members on the committee and to develop consensus. And so, finally, the whole term consensus in collaboration means that everybody gets heard. So there's a lot of listening that goes on. You have to listen. Everybody needs to feel that they were heard. But everybody doesn't get 100% of what they want. They have to be able to live with the answer. We do have ways of doing dissenting opinions. It happens very rarely. But at the end of the day, they can live with what comes out, and they commit to whatever that means for their organization. So it's a lot that goes on at RTCA. Consensus and building trust is the essence of what you all do when you work on our committees. And I think what we view ourselves at RTCA is kind of a lever. So we do all this with fewer than 15 people on the staff at RTCA, which I think surprises a lot of people. But we, through those 15 people, reach out to thousands on the committees and make all this happen.
I know you also have underpinning all this a pretty sophisticated infrastructure. I asked Margaret one time to put me on the list to get committee messaging, and my goodness, they come fast and furious. But that allows the people to connect, to edit documents, review documents, and really get behind the recommendations that come in.
Yeah, it is a sort of a SharePoint-like environment, and it's set up to facilitate the committee. So they have everything they need. They can, even if you miss a meeting, you can go and see what happened. It's got calendars, but it also has in it a tool that helps once we're developing the final recommendations. We do that through that capability as well, and that forces everyone who has comments on the products to document those comments in a way that does three things. One is what issue do they have? Second, what is their constructive way to fix that issue? And third, how important is this to them? Anywhere from editorial all the way to I don't concur. Right. And then those are dealt with by the committee through that process. And we can literally go back years later and recreate how we got to a final answer. And that's important. Sometimes we've been asked years later how we got to TCAS recommendations. You can go back and look.
Now, I sometimes tell our friends at the FAA that one of the reasons that we're all passionate about the recommendations that come in and want to follow up is because of the commitment we made to all these people, sometimes well over 100, 200 people involved with the committee. But you make a real commitment, I think, to those who serve on RTCA committees to make sure that the recommendations are heard and followed through. Doesn't mean they're all accepted, doesn't mean things don't change, but at least they get paid attention to. How do you go about doing that?
Well, and that's a good question. It is, I think, one of the reasons that people keep coming back and working on the committees is because even though it is advice and the FAA can take it or leave it, they're involved throughout, and they work pretty hard to integrate them. So it's fairly straightforward when it comes to standards. At the end of every program management committee meeting, the FAA will read us a list of all the TSOs and advisory circulars they've issued against our standards. And we sometimes measure how quickly from the time we publish a standard to the time they reference it as a means of compliance. And the shortest was an ADSB one that happened the same day. Sometimes they take up to 6 months, but that's why there's so much work that goes into these standards, because they become a means of compliance. On the policy side and the operational side, they find their way into the FAA's plans, and the FAA commits to and has routinely come back to us at the following NAC meeting or TOC meeting and given us a full report on what they've done with our recommendations. So they're equally transparent in how they've implemented and where they didn't, why they didn't.
Okay. Well, it's a small team doing an amazing amount of work, but ultimately an awful lot still flows to you. How do you spend your time? What do you focus on?
Because the team is so amazing, I can spend some percentage of my time on strategy, although I have to say they get nervous when I do that. Over the last year, I have to say probably an inordinate amount of time has been spent on the Drone Advisory Committee, and that's partly because the NAC and the TOC have really gotten to a point where they really are trusting one another, and they know how to take assignments and work them. Andy Sabula is instrumental in making sure all that happens, Vice President of RTCA. And the TOC as well with Trin, and you'll hear from Trin later, working with the DFOs at the FAA as well, Lynn Ray and folks that really help move this forward. The Drone Advisory Committee, I think even I underestimated the clash of culture that is happening on that group with not even just manned and unmanned aviation, but inside Washington versus Silicon Valley, just different ways of thinking, different ways of talking.
People new to the whole aviation
completely
community.
New to aviation, new to consensus, and different language. When they say one thing, they literally, 3 people will use the same word and mean 3 different things. So we have to give ourselves time to work through that, and so that takes time. So there's a fair amount of attention on that this past year.
How do you, time is critical for everybody. How do you go about recruiting people? These are intense, fully engaged kinds of committees. How do you recruit?
Well, we certainly have some of our go-to people who I'm surprised they answer the phone when I call, because they know usually when Margaret calls, it's going to be asking for more help. When a new committee is formed, and again, sometimes committees are formed because some of our members ask us to ask the FAA to ask for a committee. But all members of RTCA get noticed of any new initiative and are invited to come and get involved. We will reach out after we work with the FAA on the kinds of expertise we need. We'll reach out among that membership to find leaders for the committees. I think for the most part they find that there's some influence that comes with being involved. Our staff tries to help them get the work done. So it's with the Drone Advisory Committee, we literally sent out with the FAA a notice out publicly. We had 400 applications to be on a 35-person panel. So then you go through a long process of defining criteria, and so it was sort of having that many people was actually, in some ways it was nice to be able to select from really a lot of those people, just highly qualified to be on it. So I think it's partly because they know there's going to be a value.
One of the words on the chart that you put up is transparency, and I've found it remarkable how transparent RTCA is. It really does give everybody sort of a look at what's going on, whether it's the NAC or the DAC or some of the committees. Also gives Congress, also gives the media. How does that work, and is that an advantage, do you think, for what this commitment to transparency for what RTCA is trying to undertake?
I think at the end of the day, it's a good thing, because you have as many people as possible involved in the process with an ability to influence the outcome. there's less likelihood of people coming back around and trying to undermine it. It comes, though, with some amount of overhead and work to ensure that kind of transparency. So, and you can't always develop recommendations in a totally public, everything public setting. So what the Advisory Committee Act allows you to do is have the higher level committees be where everything is vetted publicly and anyone can come, and those are all noticed in the Federal Register in advance with agenda so people know what's going to be discussed. We create working groups under those, and that's where a lot of the actual work gets done. None of that, those are done in closed sessions. None of their work can go back to the FAA without going through the open, higher level committee. So it's sort of a balance there to be able to do some of the work and get a little more traction and then bring things out into the open.
You know, you have, and maybe surprise some, you have a board, you have a policy board. Even though the FAA asks and provides taskings, how do you use the policy board and the board? How are they utilized in the governance process here?
So you know a little bit, being the chairman of the board, and it's evolved over time.
Yeah, it has.
You know, RTCA started in 1935. This, I know you weren't there, but I know you know that.
I heard about it.
And I wasn't either. I wasn't either.
Mark and I were busy starting AOPA about that time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We were actually originally even part of government, and that evolved over the years, developed, you know, came into being to develop standards. In 1990, RTCA was incorporated into a not-for-profit 501c3 corporation, and we had a board up until then. When that happened, we needed to separate out any government members, especially FAA, who charters us, not to be in a fiduciary role over a corporation. So we separated and created a board of directors, which you currently chair, and there are 5 of us on the board of directors. And then the board of directors, those 5 people plus another 15 sit on a policy board. Policy board, they meet 3 times a year, and they are just that. They help me and RTCA think about where we should be headed. We are in the process of getting ready for our annual meeting of members, and we'll work with the policy board to say, do we have any gaps on the board itself and in what RTCA is likely to be asked to take on? You know, as we start looking at things like cybersecurity and commercial space, do we need more on the board? But the board will help with really even with telling us what we should be encouraging the FAA to be coming to RTCA to help work on. They sometimes, and they used to even more, oversee even some of the recommendations that come back out of the federal advisory committees.
It's probably also, not to get into the weeds, then we're going to turn back to aviation in a minute, but RTCA's funding really comes from a very broad base of support. It includes government, includes companies. I know the organization is financially pretty strong,
Don't say that.
Not huge, but it's made possible through the financial support you get from many, right?
Multiple sources. So the biggest source is the FAA, who charters us every 2 years, usually, and that is and that lays out all the federal advisory committees they expect us to operate, and they give us money to help us do that. And then we have all of our members, and many of you in the room are members of RTCA, and the membership dues also go a long way to help defray the costs that grow every year to the kinds of, not only to our workspace infrastructure, but also the fact that we have multiple meetings going on almost any day of the week. We have a fairly sophisticated conferencing facility. So it's basically our member dues that are based on the size and gross annual revenue of the companies that are members. We have about 600 now, and that's grown from 300 over the last, say, 5 years. About a third of them are international. And then we sell our standards, our documents, to non-members. Members get them electronically for free. Others buy them. And we do a little bit of training. Mostly that's not so much a revenue generator. So those are the main sources.
So we're going to spend a lot of time in the next 2 days talking about the Next Gen Advisory Committee and substance and issues related to that. Let's home in on that a little bit, and then we'll get on with our program. But we sometimes in Washington, when something does play a fairly dominant role, and I think the NAC does, you sort of forget that, gee, it wasn't always around. It wasn't even around that long ago. So how did it come into being? Obviously, it was an FAA tasking, but how did it come into being, and how have you seen it evolve?
It actually came on the heels of our Task Force 5. So, you know, RTCA, the other thing that we have done over our history is task forces. So they are advisory committees, just like the NAC and the DAC and the TOC. But generally, the FAA, 5 times now in our history, have asked us to do something much faster, much more targeted, and get them a set of recommendations quickly. And the fourth one, actually the third one was on free flight, and that sort of is the very beginning of what evolved to the NAC. There was a free flight steering committee and I'm sure some of you in this room remember free flight. That evolved into a Air Traffic Management Advisory Committee, or the ATMAC. And the ATMAC was the body that really helped steer all of us with the FAA forward. When the Task Force 5, when the Next Gen concept was first published in 2007 for 2025, the FAA came to RTCA and asked if we could establish a task force within a number of months to help them with how we evolve from 2009 to 2025, and specifically, what do we think should be implemented in 2018? Task Force 5 did that in about 7 months. There were 350 people, 141 organizations. At the end of that, the FAA administrator said, you know, we really need to work together now on how we implement these recommendations, and they wanted to do that in a transparent way. People who worked on it wanted to do that in a transparent way. They wanted to be able to explain the recommendations. The FAA wanted to get clarification. So they asked us to do 2 things. Stand down the ATMAC and in its place create the NAC, which basically up-leveled it. So we got higher level executives on it and broadened it, added a few more stakeholders. So that was stood up and started in 2010, and it's been, we're on our 4th chairman. Each has 2-year stint. They've all been CEOs of airlines. Currently, you'll hear from, in a few minutes, Dave Bronczak from FedEx. It started with Dave Barger from JetBlue, and then Bill Ayer from Alaska, and Richard Anderson from Delta most recently, and now Dave Barger is into the first year of his 2-year term.
You know, during this path, and I think one of the great advantages has been the strength of the leadership of the NAC, all the people you mentioned, and also the breadth of the members participating. But of course, through that process, we ran into things that Washington provided, like budget sequestration and shutdowns and sort of. And at some point, in any planning process, you've got to readjust given what your realities are. And so that readjustment occurred, 4 years ago, 4 years ago, when really the FAA came and said, okay, let's focus on the priorities. So it's kind of gone from Task Force 5 to implementing Task Force 5 to, okay, we maybe can't do everything we want to do, but what are the priorities?
Yeah,
and the NAC played a very important role in that.
Yeah,
right?
I think it was Mike Whitaker, then deputy administrator, hadn't been on the job very long, actually called me and said, can you, in 2 months, take a look at our plan and come back with priorities? He was told by some of the people inside that he should have thought that through a little more before he gave us the task. But it went great. That sort of got us into Tier 1, Tier 2, what are the things that the whole community thought were the most important things to implement? We handed that back, and the FAA promptly said, all right, we got it, you gave us 11, can you give us 4, top 4? That's driven now the implementation of those top 4 priorities. We are working that in probably a closer collaboration than we've done on most of our groups, where we actually have, in each one, we've had 2 industry leaders and 2 FAA subject matter experts, one from Jim Eck's organization, the Next Gen organization, one from Terry Bristol's air traffic operation, working in tandem to develop plans and measure how well, what's happening as we implement these top 4. So that's a really working very closely together, and behind the scenes with Andy Sabula, working with Pamela Gomez, who I know is here as well, who corrals, Andy corrals the industry people and Pamela corrals the FAA people, and they do an inordinate amount of work behind the scenes to make all this happen.
Right. So now we find ourselves in 2017, and as some people may have heard, there's a fairly significant FAA restructuring process or thought going on, being debated, involving the Air Traffic Organization. This is not something I know, that RTCA has taken a position on, but what's your perspective on that, and how is RTCA thinking about that, maybe, is the way to ask that?
Yeah, and I get the question a lot. And that's where you really start looking at the two sides of RTCA. So my understanding, my sense is in any reform, any change, that what remains of the FAA will continue to need and work with RTCA the way they have since 1935 to do standards. That I think would not change. In conversations even most recently with some of the CEOs of A4A, there's a sense that whatever happens, there's going to continue to be a need for, probably even beyond what a board would provide, a need for a venue, whether it's here or not, something like the NAC, to bring those 35. It's a fairly large number to be able to reach out to everyone who would continue to want to have an input to whoever would be running the new organization. So, our feeling is that we continue to try to be a venue to get consensus. I think that need does not change.
I think the other thing that RTCA has done a very good job of, under the leadership of my friend Ed Boland, is trying to make sure that we're communicating what we're doing. I think one of the things that concerns me a great deal is that it's fine to have a debate, and people are entitled to their own positions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And we do our level best, I think, to at least provide sort of a reality check from time to time as to what is actually happening in the NAS, what's actually happening with members of the aviation community, and Ed and a committee have done a lot of thinking about how to better communicate, I think, and that's very important, especially when you go through one of these debates, which on this particular one we've done for about 30 years and haven't had a resolution yet, but we'll do it again, I guess. So a lot of ground is covered. What's the best way to kind of stay in touch and stay engaged with RTCA when people, I know this is a special opportunity because you see so much of what we do all in one place and for 2 days, but what's the best way to stay connected?
Yeah, well, I'm really happy to see the number of people who are here today, because this is our best way of letting everybody know what we do and hearing from all of you. We did just update our website. We just went through a complete overhaul. Some people thought on my staff that I was a little crazy because we overhauled the entire back office and the website and this online store. Hopefully it's easier to use now. All the information you need on any of the public meetings, including when they're happening, minutes from meetings that have happened, who serves on the committees, what the calendars are easily available at rtca.org. So that's the first place to go. It's also a place where you can see all the documents, and all members can download any of those. So you can really get a sense of what we're doing. And watching for when new committees are formed, and pick up the phone or get online and let us know you want to be involved. Our staff also sometimes will just take time and go out as we have new members and just sit down with them and explain more about who we are and what we do. So we try to put as much information as we can. We try to do a little bit more than we're actually required to by the Federal Advisory Committee Act to make the information available.
Great. I'm looking over at Andy to see, Andy, if there's any burning question that's come through the system.
There aren't any burning questions,
okay.
But can I give Margaret a question?
Boy, at your peril.
My performance review.
Andy, it's good news about the annual bonus.
It is this month.
My performance review is Thursday.
I'm just saying.
But go ahead.
Like July 1st, as I
Okay.
recall.
One of the things that that RTCA is always emphasizing in the policy realm is risk factors. And so I think maybe as a question to Margaret, like what is it that she sees as some of the major risk factors, if you will, to RTCA?
Did he really just ask me that?
He did. Well, so much for that. No.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we're working hard to integrate new entrants, and we have a long-standing process for how we do standards, how we do policy. But when you start even looking at existing standards, we need to go back and rethink a little bit about how we integrate cybersecurity into those things. But we also really, along with the FAA, need to work to see where we need to change, how we do our job, how we do business, how all of us work on committees to be able to embrace new entrants and learn from them as well. They have a different risk tolerance, even when it comes to maybe to safety or to how we try things out. They do things differently, and it isn't black and white. We can't just say you've got to learn our way, or we're trying to find that common ground. That's a challenge right now. That's for RTCA to continue to be, I think, the relevant venue for these things. We've got to find a way to get to a place where we're learning from each other. Not only, it's not just that we have to change, we have to also educate new entrants coming into the system. So I would see some of the new entrants as a big challenge for us. They're here to stay. The aviation, what's flying in the sky is changing. So that's the one, and obviously the second is just what happens with reform and what the FAA will look like in the years, in a couple years. So
I didn't know you were
love your
going
thoughts
to
on that.
ask this, but I want to give you an answer from a different perspective, and with a little bit of freedom, because I'm not really an advocate at this stage. But when I was one, my reasoning for participating in RTCA and for getting the organization I was involved with, AOPA, to participate even more, and I know the reason that Mark has continued that, is because of relevancy. It's because that real work is done here and people come to the committees and express their points of view candidly. And in Washington, and a number of you are not, raised your hand that you're not in Washington. Before this, and with many other issues outside of aviation, groups come together and they say they agree to something, but then the people that didn't get everything they want run right around that group up to Congress or to the executive branch agencies. And it's a process that, I know some people feel that things move slowly, but trust me, the absence of consensus causes things to move even more slowly, and honestly allows decision makers a great deal more freedom, because if a group is fragmented, they can kind of decide to do what they want to decide to do. And the risk, it seems to me, and it only creeps in occasionally, but the risk, it seems to me, is in not participating with candid advice and counsel in these forums that RTCA provides. Because a couple things happen. First of all, the dynamics of the interaction within the community is degraded. But secondly, everybody is watching. It is transparent. So congressional staff, elected officials, members of the executive branch, if they would come to believe that the recommendations from RTCA really don't represent an honest agreement, then we will devolve into everybody chasing whatever it is they're interested in. And I think that would be a shame, because I honestly have been around this town, not quite since RTCA was formed, but for a long time, and I have never seen a community that is able to reach consensus with the skill that the aviation community does. And it serves the community very well. But a lot of that happens here and in a few other forums. But a lot of it happens here only because when you come here, you're candid. And I hope that that does not prove to be a risk in the future, but it's, I think, a concern we should remind ourselves of.
And if I could just add one thing, and that is, over the course of the next couple of days, the other way to really learn more. Andy Sabula and Al Season are sitting right here, the two vice presidents who oversee our policy and our technical work. All the program directors, Darren Allison and Claudia Chaudhry, and Rebecca Morrison, who's sitting in the back, I think, and Karen Hoffman, who's going to be herding people. You guys might want to stand up. They're go-to people. Talk to them. They can tell you lots of things about that I don't even know. Darren, I think, may be still working on getting us ready for our award lunch. Anyway, feel free to talk. And I think most of them are wearing some color, some sort of teal today. So
with that, please thank Margaret Jenney for her leadership.
Thank you.